For those of you who want a truly great Game of Thrones based video game, I think we may have just jumped into the best possible timeline to make that happen. And suddenly I'm feeling like within several years we will actually have that type of game. This newfound optimism is the result of a video that I just watched from the channel The Dragon Demands. I'll have it as one of the end cards to this video if you make it there. The Dragon Demands does a good job covering a lot of journalism around A Song of Ice and Fire and sort of things that are happening behind the scenes, but they also do cover leaks and things like that, so if you want to remain completely spoiler free, just tread with caution, just a fair warning, but I really do like a lot of their work. Also, the specific video I'm linking at the end doesn't contain any of those types of spoilers. This particular video is talking about how WB Games, who would be in charge of making any A Song of Ice and Fire based video games, is changing their CEO for the first time in 12 years. And in addition to this, something that's got me even more excited because a CEO change can mean anything, they have now officially started supporting mods for their games. For some of their current games, they're apparently rolling out full on tech support for modders to make their lives easier. And this is such a bullish sign if you want a good Game of Thrones game several years from now, because, well, currently all of the best Game of Thrones based video games are fan modifications. I literally can't imagine a better scenario to get a great Game of Thrones game 5 or so years down the line than having a major studio say, okay, we are committed to making the best possible Game of Thrones game that we can, and then also we're committed to making it as moddable as possible so that people can turn it into whatever they want to. Imagine if they could spend 5 years creating a really solid game, especially just building a big old game world, and a decent story at least, and then modders can just go crazy on it afterwards. Skyrim modders have been going crazy on that game ever since it came out, and they've built entirely new games within that game. They're doing things like recreating Oblivion and Morrowind in Skyrim, they're building entirely new provinces, doing all sorts of crazy things. Imagine doing something like that, but set in a base game of Westeros. The things that I would expect this fandom to be capable of coming up with would be incredible. And I think if they could create one truly great Game of Thrones based video game and have it be really moddable, they would have an instant hit on their hands, and I think people would be building things onto that for years and years to come. Basically, we're at one of those situations that I feel like a lot of times fans often find themselves in where, as fans, we're looking at a situation where someone owns the rights to a property and we're just like, why don't they do the thing? There's such an obvious thing they should be doing with the rights to this thing, and they're not doing it. And in this case, it looks like WB Games is just directly saying, yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to try and develop over the next several years a truly good Game of Thrones game, and oh hey, what do you know, we're also rolling out tech support for modders for some of our biggest games. So this is just, as I said, like all signs pointing towards go. They've actually figured it out. They're actually looking like they're gonna just do the right thing that all the fans seem to want. At least based on these good early signs. And since they are giving us these good early signs, I feel like it's time for us as a fandom to sort of amplify this conversation around how much of a big opportunity this is and how much of a market there actually is for a giant medieval role playing sim that's set in Westeros. If they could get it right, it would be absolutely huge. They're basically at the drawing board stage at this point for how they're going to handle their series of major Westeros video games going forward, so now is the perfect time to be building a big hype wave as a fandom about the type of games we actually want. Something that the Dragon Demands brings up in his video that I fully agree with is the best route that they could go for this game is to make it on some level sandboxy. Don't like lock the player into a single storyline. One example I would give is there's a game called Mount and Blade, and there's some incredible Game of Thrones mods for those games, because basically that game is just a big medieval sandbox, and that's exactly what a great Westeros game should be. The other best Game of Thrones game that currently exists is the CK2 or CK3 mods for it, and again, those games are giant medieval sandboxes. That is literally the best case scenario for a Westeros Essos type game. Just build us the big game world, make it as sandboxy as you can. If you want to have a main storyline, fine, but just make sure it's big, sandboxy, and moddable, and people are going to absolutely eat it up, in my opinion. Also, with all the technological advancements we've seen over the last several years, it feels like the potential for what modders are going to be able to do is only going to go up. So, the potential for games is going up, the potential for what modders can do is going up. All of this stuff is coming together with what seems to be, at least in my opinion, some good decision making and a pretty solid plan. Take 3 to 5 years to build a big solid Game of Thrones game, and in the meantime, embrace the modding community so that when it comes out, Well, what do you know? You're going to have the perfect storm potentially for people to build the perfect Game of Thrones game. I got to imagine all these other game company heads are looking at Todd Howard re-releasing Skyrim over and over and over again, printing money, and they all go, "Ooh, I want me some of that. I want to do that. Give me a game that I can do that with." Well, if you could build a truly great Westeros-based game and have it be highly moddable, you could do the Skyrim thing with a great Westeros game. I truly believe that's like one of the properties people would absolutely devour if you get it right. Part of the reason I wanted to make this quick video to talk about this is because so often it's these video game companies that are making these bad, greedy decisions and they get blasted for it, rightfully so. So when it looks like a company that owns the rights to a property I care about is going in the right direction, even if it's just early stage signs, I really want to encourage this, and I think we as Game of Thrones fans, Westeros fans, we should encourage them to go in this direction with a good, highly moddable, sandboxy type Game of Thrones game. Talking about things like this and encouraging it can let them know that they would have a huge market on their hands if they can get something like that right. So, sharing videos like this or the Dragon Demands video, trying to build hype around this sort of stuff when they give little signs that they could be going in this direction, well, that can only encourage them to go further in that direction. They really do still seem to be at the early stages of developing their like Game of Thrones wing of their core franchises of video games. So if we as the fandom sort of start the loud conversation around what we want these games to be like, this is the perfect time to be doing that. New CEO coming in soon, they're embracing fan modifications, they're just getting started up with the Game of Thrones wing of their major games. The perfect time really is right now to have this conversation. So yeah, let's as a fandom start talking a lot about what the perfect Game of Thrones type video games from WB Games would be like. I'm curious to hear any ideas you guys have down in the comments for what type of game you would want them to build. In my dream world, I think like something along the lines of Skyrim in Westeros, as I said earlier, but with some mixed in mechanics like sort of Mountain Blade style, where you can like build factions or do political maneuvering, things like that, take a castle eventually. Like imagine you could go into a bandit camp, recruit a bunch of bandits, or even set out from Flea Bottom with a bunch of peasants and turn them into a warrior band, right? Like you can just take your little crew around Westeros and have a bunch of dynamic interactions with all these different groups of bandits, peasants, farmers, lords in their castles, and just try to, potentially move your way up in the world the way you sort of do in Mountain Blade. And as long as you have the buying and selling of goods, you can just take your little army of dudes and you don't even need to be bandits. You can just take goods from one location to another and make sure you're well protected. Suddenly, you're a merchant band and you're making money. Imagine a game where you could basically either lead a bandit clan where you're raiding farms and taking things to become rich and trying to fight the law, or where you become like the Brotherhood without banners where you're protecting people in wartime and fighting off other bandits as you try to protect like your little area. If you allow the world to dynamically evolve based on your actions and the actions of other like factions around you, and then you build like a Brotherhood without banners style gang and you take over an area, well, you could protect that area, then it would prosper up, you would maybe build reputation with those people, and maybe they could make you their leader. Eventually, maybe you could recruit enough people to take over a castle and become a small lord, but then of course some people would hate you, so you'd have to like fight them off. That's something you can do in Mountain Blade. But if you just had a ton of dynamic interactions like that, where maybe you can, okay, take over an area and then join up with some king and take over a castle in his name, suddenly you're his bannerman and you have protection. All these types of dynamics work so well in Game of Thrones, you just need to build them into your game world and let people play with them. We've had lots of major games where there are settlement building type features involved, and imagine how awesome that would be in Westeros. You could take your bandit group out into the woods, find a good location, and just start building up walls, sending people out to gather resources, and eventually you have a little settlement that you can guard. I'm telling you, the potential is limitless if they can get just the world building of Westeros right and put it into a big moddable game world. Which, for the record, I think they can do. If we're loud about what we want them to take seriously as a fandom, I think they can take that stuff seriously and produce a really solid game. Big video games like this are the perfect medium to take lore seriously and pack in some really deep lore in little hidden ways that casual fans don't need to interact with if they don't want to. Skyrim and Elden Ring are perfect examples of this, where you can have tons of incredible lore for people to dive into for days and days and days, or people can just miss all of it and still really enjoy the game. Westeros lends itself perfectly to a giant video game world like that. With such a dedicated fandom that takes the lore so seriously, you really couldn't ask for a better opportunity to build a video game around, as long as you take it seriously and do it right. Just build the best version of Westeros you can and let people throw themselves into it. Don't build it into a certain set storyline you have to follow, just build a bunch of different factions with the ability to take land and grant you the ability to take land in their name and build factions like that, like feudalism actually did. Building a big feudalism sim in Westeros is such a fun idea for a game, that's basically what the best versions of these games are. And if it's a good, well built game world, you could do this in the Kingswood, or you could take a pirate ship out to sea and raid in the Stepstones, or you could build a coven that sacrifices people to weirwoods and tries to gain old godsy magical powers, right? You could be doing all sorts of really cool Westeros roleplay in this big giant world. That's what video game players want. Westeros itself is so interesting as a character, basically, that if you build a good sandboxy version of it, people will just throw themselves in there and the stories write themselves. People will just be able to go get up to all sorts of shenanigans and they'll have their own fun. You don't need a brilliant, giant main story to get this done, at least in my opinion. It obviously helps, like Skyrim has one, but at the same time, you can mod the heck out of it and completely ignore it if you want to. A lot of these best Game of Thrones games allow you to just go out there into the world and interact with these dynamic systems and ways that the world interacts with each other. And then the game world moves forward and the player can write their own story into the world based on their actions. That's the thing that's the most fun to do in these types of worlds. The last thing that I would want to see is the typical, like, you go, you do your quest, you get your cutscene, you go to the next place, you do your quest, you get your cutscene. In my opinion, doing anything like that in a version of a Westeros game, if that's your big giant game that you're trying to sell, it would just be a huge waste of this opportunity. Like, there are so many other games that can do that. Westeros and Essos works best as this giant, awesome sandbox to throw yourself into. The Dragon Demands phrases it in a good way in his video, which again I recommend you check out after this, where he says, "We don't need another friend of Jon Snow you've never heard of." Just trying to force people into, like, oh, I remember these characters, and then forcing those characters into a set storyline that you have to follow, that's not nearly as fun as just building a big game world with those characters in them. And if the player does want to go seek out the Starks, well, they can go walk to Winterfell and say hi. Or if they want to go find who's in King's Landing, they can go check it out. But don't force them to do so. When playing a Westeros game, there's going to be times where I don't want to be friends with Jon Snow. I want to go do something else somewhere else. And in the times where I do want to be friends with Jon Snow, I don't want to start off as friends with Jon Snow because the story says so. I want to go make friends with Jon Snow because that's a character action my character has taken. Like open world style, like make it a choice and you go seek out Jon Snow and do something to make friends with him. Suddenly, being friends with Jon Snow feels real rather than just like, oh, okay, I guess I'm friends with Jon. And that feeling still does apply if the story carries you there, right? Like if you're on rails and you're taken to the wall and you're now friends with Jon Snow, it's just like, okay, well, I did the thing, I guess I'm friends with Jon. But if you're presented with a big open game world and you're a nobody and you go seek out Jon at the wall and befriend him, well, then suddenly you're gaming rather than just being carried. In my opinion, that's how most fans that are gamers will actually want to interact with Westeros. That's the way that I think WB Games would approach this if they want to try make a game that's truly long lasting for Westeros fans and truly capitalizes on this golden gaming opportunity that they have by having these rights. And I suppose if you are going to insist on building a game where you're forced to go like quest, cutscene, quest, cutscene, quest, cutscene, just please make the world big, gigantic, and so moddable that modders can get their way around that and turn it into a sandbox. If you can at least do that, I do think the game will have a lot of staying power if you get the world right. Westeros is obviously a very character driven world, so it would make a lot of sense that you would think, oh, all these people who are huge fans of these books want to interact with these characters that they love. And on a certain level, yes, but video gaming is a completely different medium. You want to be able to be the character in the story. You want your actions to have an actual effect on the world, and that's, in my opinion, why making a sandboxy type of game where the world dynamically evolves over time as you play and your actions can completely change the directions that things go, well, that's the best way to handle a Westeros game. Let me build my character as a nobody from nowhere, build up a small mercenary gang, and decide where I want to try end up. Do I just want to build a coven and sacrifice to weirwoods in the woods? Or do I want to become a pirate king, or try take over a castle and become a lord in my own right and start playing the Game of Thrones? If you can put these options on the table for a player into a good game world, you're going to have a massive hit on your hands. Let me know though down in the comments what type of Westeros-based video game you would want to see. Maybe share this with a friend who also plays games and likes A Song of Ice and Fire, and we can get some discussion going about what direction WB Games should go with this. In my opinion, it's a good time to get loud and encourage them to go in the right direction because it seems like they're starting to do that. Thank you all very much for watching. Check out something in the end cards here. Like and subscribe, and I'll be back with something else very soon.